Socrates placed virtue at the very center of human existence, declaring that the examined life was the only one worthy of being lived. He did not seek wealth, fame, or comfort, but pursued the clarity of the soul, insisting that ignorance was the greatest human disease. To understand Socrates is to understand the relentless search for truth that emerges through questioning, not as a possession handed down by authority, but as a lived process of inquiry. He stripped away illusions by interrogating assumptions, forcing those around him to confront contradictions within their own beliefs. His philosophy was less a doctrine than a method, less a set of conclusions than a radical devotion to seeking the meaning of justice, virtue, and knowledge in every corner of life. The Socratic method was not a game of rhetoric, but an exposure of error. He approached people who claimed wisdom, politicians, poets, artisans, and demonstrated that while they thought they knew, their knowledge dissolved under scrutiny. This was not done to humiliate, but to reveal the fragility of human certainty. For Socrates, awareness of one's ignorance was the beginning of wisdom. Only when one recognized the limits of knowledge could one begin to pursue truth properly. This humility before the vast unknown distinguished Socratic philosophy from the arrogance of sophists who sold cleverness as wisdom. His refusal to give fixed answers stemmed from the recognition that human life was dynamic, that truth unfolded in dialogue, and that the task of philosophy was never-ending. The relation between virtue and knowledge was one of Socrates' deepest convictions. He held that no one willingly does wrong. Wrongdoing arises from ignorance of the good. This view dismantles the idea that evil is a positive force chosen deliberately. Instead, it reflects a lack of proper understanding. If someone knew the true nature of justice and the true benefits of living justly, they would act accordingly, for the soul naturally seeks what is beneficial. Thus, moral failure is not malice, but blindness. To cure this blindness requires education not in the superficial sense of memorizing facts, but in the transformation of the soul through questioning, dialogue, and self-examination. In this sense, philosophy itself was a form of therapy, healing the distortions of the soul. Socrates saw the soul as the true self, superior to the body and its desires. The body demanded food, pleasure, wealth, and power, but the soul demanded truth and virtue. To care for the soul was to orient life toward what was eternal rather than temporary. Death did not frighten him, for death was merely the release of the soul from bodily distractions. What was terrifying was the corruption of the soul through injustice, dishonesty, or cowardice. This is why he could accept his own execution calmly. To escape punishment by betraying his principles would save the body, but destroy the soul. To preserve the soul through integrity, even at the cost of death, was the highest form of human courage. Justice was another axis of Socratic thought. He asked whether justice was simply the advantage of the stronger, as some argued, or whether it had a higher reality independent of power. Through endless questioning, he revealed that justice could not be reduced to arbitrary rules or political decrees. Justice was bound up with the harmony of the soul and the community. To act justly was not merely to obey, but to participate in the health of the whole. A just person contributed to order, balance, and mutual flourishing, while an unjust person introduced disorder and harm. Thus, justice was not an external burden, but an inner necessity for living well. One who harmed others harmed themselves, for the corruption of the soul followed every unjust act. Knowledge, for Socrates, was inseparable from virtue,
But knowledge was not mere information. To know something was to integrate it into one's life, to embody it. A person might recite definitions of justice, but still be unjust. This was not knowledge, but opinion. Real knowledge transformed the soul. Hence, philosophy was a lived practice, not an academic exercise. The dialectical method was meant to awaken this transformation, forcing interlocutors to move beyond comfortable cliches. By constantly exposing contradictions, Socrates drove people toward deeper reflection. His irony, pretending ignorance to reveal another's ignorance, was not mockery, but a catalyst for self-realization. Through this irony, he compelled others to turn inward, to examine themselves, and in doing so, to awaken to the pursuit of genuine wisdom. Courage, temperance, and piety all underwent similar interrogation under Socratic inquiry. Courage was not simply reckless daring, but knowledge of what was truly to be feared and what was not. Temperance was not mere abstinence, but the wisdom of moderation grounded in understanding the proper place of desires. Piety was not blind ritual, but the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the divine order. In every case, the essence of virtue was bound to knowledge, and knowledge was inseparable from questioning. The virtues were not isolated, but interwoven, each dependent upon the deeper insight into what it means to live rightly. Socratic philosophy therefore unified ethics into a coherent vision rooted in the health of the soul.
Socrates was also deeply political, though not in the sense of holding office or drafting laws. His politics was a politics of conscience, questioning the legitimacy of authority and the morality of collective action. He saw the danger of unreflective democracy as much as the tyranny of oligarchs. To obey blindly was no virtue. To disobey unjustly was no virtue either. The citizen had the responsibility to examine laws, to test them against justice, and to align obedience with conscience. This is why, when condemned to death by the Athenian jury, he did not escape into exile even though his friends offered it. To undermine the laws would be to corrupt the foundation of civic order, and this would contradict his devotion to justice. Yet he also refused to flatter the people or conform to popular opinion. His stance was radical. The philosopher must stand apart from both tyranny and mob, guided only by the pursuit of truth. Death itself became one of his greatest philosophical demonstrations. In the Apology, he told the court that fearing death was a form of false wisdom, for no one knew whether death was the greatest evil or the greatest good. To claim knowledge of what one cannot know was the very ignorance he opposed. Instead, he embraced uncertainty, showing that the true task of the philosopher was not to cling to life, but to remain faithful to virtue, regardless of consequence. His calm acceptance of the hemlock became the ultimate testimony of his teaching, that the soul's health is worth more than the body's survival. This act etched his philosophy into history more powerfully than any written treatise could have. The legacy of Socratic thought extended through Plato, who preserved and expanded his teacher's method, and through generations of thinkers who grappled with the meaning of justice, virtue, and truth. Yet even apart from later elaborations, the Socratic stance remains radical: to question everything, to refuse dogmatic certainty, to acknowledge ignorance as the beginning of wisdom, and to live a life wholly devoted to the care of the soul. Philosophy, in this sense, was not an academic pursuit, but the very art of living. To be Socratic is to live in dialogue, to embrace uncertainty, and to prioritize integrity above all else. Socrates made ignorance into a profound teacher, and he reshaped the very meaning of wisdom by redefining it as recognition of one's limits. When he declared that he knew nothing, this was not a display of false modesty, but an articulation of a principle that shattered complacency. Others believed themselves wise because they had accumulated knowledge in certain domains, but Socrates revealed that knowledge without reflection often concealed deeper confusion. To know nothing was not despair, but liberation, for it cleared the mind of arrogance and made space for genuine inquiry. This acknowledgement created a foundation upon which authentic understanding could be built. Thus, his profession of ignorance was a philosophical stance, a commitment to relentless questioning and openness rather than final answers. The role of questioning in Socratic philosophy cannot be overstated. Every conversation was a battlefield where assumptions were tested, often destroyed, and sometimes rebuilt stronger. By constantly asking, "What is it?" whether it was justice, piety, or courage, Socrates pressed his interlocutors to move beyond examples and into essence. It was easy for someone to list actions considered just, but Socrates demanded clarity of definition. This exposed the fragility of common opinions, for most people lived guided by vague notions without precision. By uncovering contradictions, he forced others to realize that their confidence was misplaced. Yet this was not cruelty. It was a form of intellectual midwifery, helping to birth new understanding. The method of elenchus, the process of refutation and cross-examination, was less about demolishing others and more about guiding them to self-discovery. This process revealed a striking truth. Most people lived without genuine self-knowledge. They pursued wealth, honor, or pleasure without asking why these things mattered or whether they were good in themselves. Socrates described himself as a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting Athens out of complacency. His persistent questions unsettled the city because they exposed that citizens who prided themselves on being the pinnacle of Greek civilization were often unable to justify their values. To be confronted by Socrates was to be confronted by one's own ignorance, and this was rarely pleasant. Yet he believed it was necessary, for only through such disturbance could the soul awaken. The pursuit of truth was uncomfortable, but comfort was not the measure of value. Transformation required disturbance, and Socrates was relentless in disturbing the illusions of those around him.
Ethics in Socratic philosophy was inseparable from knowledge because ignorance was the root of all vice. When someone acted unjustly, it was not because they chose evil with full awareness, but because they misperceived the good. They sought happiness through wealth, power, or pleasure without realizing that these pursuits corrupted the soul rather than nurtured it. If one truly understood what led to happiness, one would act virtuously. This principle has immense implications. Moral education is not the imposition of rules, but the cultivation of insight. Instead of punishing wrongdoers as if they were malicious, Socrates' view suggests that society should heal ignorance through reflection. The task of philosophy, then, was to illuminate the good so that people could act rightly by necessity, for knowledge naturally aligned with virtue. Consider courage under this framework. Ordinary Athenians might describe courage as facing danger without fear, particularly in battle. But Socrates pressed further. Was the reckless soldier who ran blindly into death courageous or merely foolish? Courage, properly understood, required knowledge of what should and should not be feared. To fear dishonor more than death was rational, for dishonor corrupted the soul, while death merely ended bodily existence. True courage, therefore, was inseparable from wisdom. It was not the absence of fear, but the presence of right judgment. By dissecting courage this way, Socrates revealed that even the most celebrated virtues could not stand alone. They required grounding in knowledge of the good. The same applied to temperance. To restrain desire without understanding was meaningless, for asceticism could be as empty as indulgence. The glutton who consumed without measure and the hermit who starved himself both failed in wisdom if they lacked knowledge of what was truly beneficial. Temperance was moderation born of insight, not mere self-denial. It was the ordering of the soul so that desires served the good rather than enslaved the person. Thus, Socratic philosophy cut through superficial morality and demanded deeper grounding. Virtue was not a mask of behavior, but the alignment of the soul with truth. Piety posed one of the most challenging questions for Socratic thought. In dialogues, he asked whether something was pious because the gods loved it, or whether the gods loved it because it was pious. This question dismantled the common understanding of religion in Athens, where piety meant performing rituals to honor the gods. If the gods loved something simply because it was pious, then piety existed as an independent standard beyond divine whim. This elevated morality above mere obedience, suggesting that even the gods recognized an eternal order of justice and goodness. If piety was only what pleased the gods, then morality became arbitrary. By raising this dilemma, Socrates unsettled conventional religious thought and pointed toward the idea that morality must have a rational foundation beyond authority. This was a radical shift in perspective, paving the way for philosophical theology. Socrates also challenged political assumptions with his philosophy. Athens prided itself on democracy, but Socrates questioned whether majority opinion equated to truth. If the many were ignorant, then the collective could be as blind as the individual. Truth was not determined by votes, but by reason. This was not an argument for tyranny, for he equally rejected the arrogance of rulers who imposed their will without justice. Instead, he pointed toward a higher measure of politics, governance guided by wisdom. Leaders must understand justice, not merely command power. Yet Socrates himself avoided political office, recognizing that his mission was philosophical rather than legislative. He engaged politics through questioning, by compelling citizens to reflect on their civic responsibilities and the meaning of justice. His trial and execution demonstrated the tension between philosophy and politics, a tension that continues through history. The trial of Socrates stands as one of the greatest philosophical moments. Accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, he stood before the Athenian jury and defended his life as a service to the gods. He insisted that his questioning was divinely ordained, that he was a gift to the city rather than a threat. To silence him would be to silence the voice of conscience that stirred Athens to reflection. Yet he refused to beg for mercy or compromise his principles. Even when offered exile as an alternative, he rejected it, for to abandon philosophy would betray his calling. In choosing death over silence, Socrates transformed his life into a testimony. The hemlock became not defeat, but victory, proving that philosophy could triumph over fear, that the soul's integrity outweighed survival. His death was the culmination of his teaching, that the examined life was worth dying for, if necessary. The idea of the examined life lies at the heart of his philosophy. To live without examining one's beliefs, desires, and actions was to live blindly. Most people drift through existence seeking pleasure, wealth, or approval, never asking whether these pursuits are good. Socrates insisted that every human being had the responsibility to interrogate life, to bring assumptions into the light of reason. This was not a luxury for the educated elite, but a universal necessity. The examined life was the only life that aligned with the soul's true purpose. Without it, humans remained enslaved to ignorance, trapped in cycles of error and dissatisfaction. With it, they approached wisdom, freedom, and virtue. The radical claim of Socratic philosophy is that philosophy itself is not optional, but essential to human existence. Knowledge, virtue, the soul, justice, courage, temperance, piety, politics, and death. All these themes interwove into a unified vision. For Socrates, to live well was not to possess wealth, power, or even health, but to possess the harmony of the soul. This harmony arose through knowledge, and knowledge emerged through questioning. Philosophy was therefore the art of living, not an abstract discipline. By embodying his principles to the end, Socrates proved that philosophy was not only about words, but about life and death. His legacy endures not in doctrines, but in the example of a life wholly devoted to truth. The connection between knowledge and virtue in Socratic thought also redefined responsibility. If wrongdoing arises from ignorance, then the task of the individual is not merely to avoid evil, but to pursue understanding. This transforms ethics from a negative restriction into a positive quest. One does not simply refrain from crime or dishonor. One actively seeks wisdom in order to act rightly. Ignorance is not innocence, for failing to examine life allows error to dominate. Each person bears the duty to examine themselves and their world, to strive toward clarity. In this sense, Socratic philosophy democratizes moral responsibility. No one is excused from the demand to think. Philosophy is not the privilege of scholars, but the obligation of all. Yet Socrates did not offer ready-made doctrines. He left no writings, no systematic teachings, and no fixed creed. His wisdom lay in dialogue, in the dynamic unfolding of ideas through questioning. This unsettled many, for human beings crave certainty and rules to follow. But Socrates resisted the temptation to give answers that might become idols. He preferred to dwell in uncertainty, to leave others in the discomfort of questioning. This was his greatest gift, the invitation to live in the tension between ignorance and truth. By refusing to close inquiry, he opened philosophy to perpetual growth. His silence in writing became a form of teaching, forcing others to take responsibility for their own search rather than clinging to his authority. The charge that he corrupted the youth reveals how disruptive his philosophy was. Young Athenians flocked to him because he gave them tools to challenge their elders. In a society built on tradition and respect for authority, this was explosive. He taught them not what to think, but how to think, not to repeat what was said, but to question it. This undermined the comfort of the powerful and revealed the fragility of convention. Yet Socrates would argue that to awaken critical thinking was not corruption, but the highest form of education. To shield the youth from inquiry was to enslave them to ignorance. By challenging them, he freed them to pursue virtue with their own minds. The Socratic paradoxes, such as "no one does wrong willingly," or "it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it," reveal the radical nature of his thought. To claim that wrongdoing is ignorance challenges the instinctive belief that people sometimes choose evil knowingly. But for Socrates, the soul always seeks what it perceives as good. The error lies in misperception, in mistaking short-term pleasure or advantage for true benefit. Similarly, to say that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it upturns natural instincts of self-preservation. Yet for Socrates, the health of the soul outweighed the pain of the body. To commit injustice was to wound one's own soul, while to suffer injustice left the soul intact. In this reversal, he placed morality above survival, integrity above advantage. The pursuit of truth in Socratic philosophy required courage not only in battle, but in dialogue. To stand exposed, to admit ignorance, to face the collapse of one's cherished opinions, this required bravery greater than facing physical danger. Many avoided him because they feared the disorientation that his questions produced. Yet to endure this disorientation was the path to wisdom. Courage in philosophy was the willingness to face one's own ignorance without denial, to let go of false certainty, and to continue seeking despite discomfort. Socrates embodied this courage daily, never shrinking from questioning even the most powerful citizens. His life was an example of intellectual bravery, showing that the pursuit of truth required as much strength as any battlefield. The soul, for Socrates, was not merely a breath of life, but the seat of reason and virtue. To care for the soul was the highest duty, greater than caring for wealth, reputation, or even the body. This care required constant examination, discipline, and pursuit of wisdom. The unexamined soul became enslaved to desires, tossed about by pleasures and fears. But the examined soul attained order, harmony, and resilience. Such a soul could face death without terror, for its value did not depend on bodily existence. By elevating the soul, Socrates shifted the axis of human life from external success to internal integrity. He urged every person to look inward, to measure themselves not by possessions or honors, but by the state of their soul.
His approach to death remains one of the most profound contributions of his philosophy. In his final hours, he spoke calmly of death as either a dreamless sleep or a transition to another form of existence. In either case, there was nothing to fear. If it was a sleep, then it was peaceful. If it was a continuation, then it offered the chance to converse with past thinkers and heroes. The true evil was not death, but injustice, not mortality, but corruption. By embracing death without fear, Socrates demonstrated that philosophy was a preparation for dying. To live philosophically was to detach from the trivialities of the body and to orient oneself toward what was eternal. Death, then, was not defeat, but the final test of a philosopher's integrity. In this way, Socratic philosophy unified ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics into a single vision of life. Knowledge was virtue. Virtue was the health of the soul. The soul was the true self, and death was the release of the soul into what lay beyond. Each part interlocked with the others, forming a coherent whole. Yet Socrates never claimed to possess this system as doctrine. He lived it as inquiry. He asked questions not to end dialogue, but to continue it endlessly. His greatness lay not in giving answers, but in showing that life itself must become a question. Philosophy was not about resolving uncertainty, but about dwelling in it with integrity. The tension between appearance and reality was central to Socratic inquiry. People often confused seeming knowledge with true knowledge, mistaking eloquence for wisdom or success for virtue. Socrates dismantled this confusion by showing that appearances could be deceptive. A person might speak beautifully, yet hold contradictory beliefs. A general might win battles, yet misunderstand courage. A politician might command authority, yet act unjustly. True reality lay beneath appearances, and philosophy was the art of stripping away illusions. The Socratic method functioned like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through the surface to expose the hidden structures of thought.
This relentless pursuit of essence over semblance became the defining mark of his philosophy and one of its most enduring legacies. This distinction also shaped his view of rhetoric. Sophists in Athens taught persuasive speech as a tool for success, equipping students to win arguments and gain power. Socrates resisted this trend, insisting that persuasion without knowledge was manipulation. To convince others without knowledge was not wisdom, but sophistry. He drew a sharp line between winning debates and seeking truth. The former served ego and ambition, the latter served the soul. By exposing sophists, he revealed the danger of reducing language to a weapon rather than a path to understanding. For Socrates, words were sacred tools for uncovering truth, not instruments of deception. This uncompromising stance made him unpopular among those who profited from rhetoric, yet it preserved philosophy from corruption. Education, in his philosophy, was not transmission of information, but transformation of the soul. Teachers were not depositors of knowledge, but midwives of understanding. Socrates compared himself to a midwife who helped others give birth to ideas, but produced none of his own. This metaphor illustrates his humility and his method. He did not claim authority, but facilitated self-discovery. True learning occurred when a person recognized contradictions, confronted ignorance, and struggled toward clarity. The role of the teacher was to guide this struggle, not to provide ready-made answers. This conception of education reshaped the very meaning of teaching, laying foundations for later traditions of dialogue and critical pedagogy. It remains one of his most revolutionary contributions, turning education into an act of liberation.
The unity of the virtues also emerges in Socratic philosophy. Although people often treated virtues as separate, courage, temperance, justice, piety, Socrates suggested they were aspects of a single knowledge of the good. Without knowledge, none of them could stand. Courage without wisdom became recklessness. Temperance without wisdom became deprivation. Justice without wisdom became conformity. And piety without wisdom became superstition. Each virtue was a reflection of the same insight into what was truly beneficial for the soul. This unity revealed the coherence of moral life. To pursue one virtue fully was to pursue all, for they converged in the same knowledge. Thus, virtue was not a collection of qualities, but a harmony born of wisdom. His life also demonstrated the tension between individual conscience and collective authority. Athens demanded conformity to its laws and traditions, but Socrates maintained that the voice of conscience, guided by reason, was higher. He followed what he described as a divine sign, a daimonion, that warned him against certain actions. This inner voice represented the primacy of conscience over external command. Yet he also respected the laws of Athens, accepting his death sentence rather than fleeing, because he believed that undermining the legal order would harm the city. His stance combined obedience and resistance in a delicate balance. Obey the law insofar as it does not demand injustice, and obey conscience above all. This tension remains central to debates about civil disobedience and the role of conscience in society. Socrates' refusal to write was itself a philosophical choice. Writing fixed words in place, giving them an appearance of permanence. But he believed that truth lived in dialogue. Written words could not defend themselves or adapt to questioning. They became idols rather than living thought. By choosing oral dialogue, he preserved philosophy as a living practice rather than a static doctrine. This decision forced his followers to carry his method forward, interpreting and reinterpreting him endlessly. In this way, his absence became his presence, ensuring that Socratic philosophy would never become a closed system.
The absence of texts kept his thought alive, resisting the temptation to reduce it to dogma. The examined life also required a new measure of success. Athenian society measured greatness by wealth, victory, influence, and fame. Socrates measured greatness by the state of the soul. A poor man who lived justly was greater than a rich man who lived unjustly. A citizen who pursued truth was nobler than a general who pursued conquest. By redefining success, he subverted the values of his time. His own poverty testified to this redefinition. He lived with little, cared nothing for possessions, and focused entirely on dialogue and reflection. His indifference to wealth and status shocked those who equated prosperity with virtue. Yet his life demonstrated that true happiness lay in inner integrity, not external accumulation. This radical simplicity continues to challenge assumptions about what it means to flourish. Socrates' paradoxical wisdom, that knowing one's ignorance is the beginning of wisdom, revealed the infinite nature of philosophy. If knowledge is always partial and provisional, then the pursuit of truth has no final endpoint. Philosophy is not a destination, but a journey. This humility protects against dogmatism, for no belief is beyond question. It also energizes inquiry, for there is always more to learn. Socratic philosophy thus refuses closure, remaining forever open-ended. This openness is its strength, for it prevents stagnation and fosters continual growth. Every generation can return to Socrates and continue the dialogue anew, applying his questions to new contexts. His philosophy is not frozen in antiquity, but lives wherever people question themselves and their world. The implications of Socratic thought extend into politics, religion, education, ethics, and epistemology. But at its core lies a simple demand: care for the soul. This demand reshapes all life. It requires justice in action, moderation in desire, courage in adversity, and humility in knowledge. It elevates philosophy from an abstract discipline to the art of living. To care for the soul is to live authentically, to align one's being with truth rather than illusion. This care is never complete, for the soul requires constant attention. But in this ongoing struggle lies the dignity of human life. The soul becomes the true battlefield, and philosophy becomes the true victory. Socrates' questioning of poets reveals another dimension of his philosophy, for poetry was highly esteemed in Athens as a divine art, inspired by the muses and carrying weight in shaping moral imagination. Socrates, however, insists that many poets compose not through knowledge, but through inspiration akin to madness, unable to explain the meaning of their verses when asked. This undermines the claim that poets possess wisdom. They may be channels of beauty, but lack conscious understanding. For Socrates, true wisdom requires not only producing fine words, but being able to account for them, rationally, to defend them against inquiry. Thus, the Socratic standard of knowledge, justification through reason, emerges here clearly, anticipating later philosophical demands for clarity and argument over mere eloquence. This stance also undermines the cultural authority of poetry, placing philosophy above traditional art forms as the true guide to wisdom.
When Socrates turns to the craftsman, he finds individuals who indeed possess genuine knowledge within their respective fields. A shipbuilder, a sculptor, or a stonemason can explain the reasons behind their craft, the methods, the causes, and the purposes of their work. Yet Socrates notes that such craftsmen, though wise in their limited domains, often fall into the error of thinking their technical expertise grants them insight into the highest questions: justice, virtue, the nature of the soul. This transgression beyond their domain shows how partial knowledge can inflate into false pretenses to universal wisdom. Here again, Socrates demonstrates that true wisdom lies in recognizing the limits of one's expertise, in refusing to extend technical skill into the realm of moral and metaphysical inquiry without proper justification. The cumulative result of these inquiries leaves Socrates with a paradoxical conclusion. If the oracle is true that none is wiser than Socrates, it must mean that human wisdom is extremely limited, and Socrates is wiser only in knowing that he does not know. This admission of ignorance is not defeatist, but transformative, for it becomes the very method of philosophy, a stance of openness, humility, and readiness to inquire. Socratic ignorance is the starting point for dialogue, the soil from which rational examination can grow. It contrasts with dogmatic certainty, which halts questioning and closes the path to truth. In this way, Socratic philosophy redefines wisdom, not as possession of final answers, but as the perpetual commitment to seeking them. This shift from possession to pursuit is revolutionary. In many cultures, wisdom is tied to tradition, revelation, or authority, yet Socrates grounds it in the living process of rational inquiry. To live philosophically is not to claim to know the ultimate nature of the cosmos, but to test every claim, every belief, every assumption through questioning. The Socratic method, the dialectical interplay of question and answer, arises directly from this recognition of ignorance. The elenchus, as it is called, exposes contradictions in the interlocutor's beliefs, forcing a reconsideration that may lead closer to truth. The very discomfort it produces is productive, awakening the soul from complacency and moving it toward clarity. Such a method reshapes the role of philosophy in human life. Instead of handing down doctrines, the philosopher becomes a midwife of ideas, helping others give birth to clearer conceptions. Socrates himself famously likens his work to that of his mother, a midwife, who assists in birth without producing children herself. Similarly, Socrates claims not to impart knowledge, but to help others examine and bring forth their own ideas, purifying them through critical dialogue. The metaphor captures the essence of philosophy as cooperative, as a shared search rather than unilateral instruction. It also emphasizes the moral responsibility of philosophy, to cultivate souls, to refine human character, to foster self-examination. The ethical dimension of this practice becomes explicit in Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. This is not hyperbole, but the central axiom of his philosophy. Life without reflection, without questioning of values and assumptions, falls into the trap of custom, habit, and uncritical acceptance of what society dictates. Such a life may be comfortable or conventionally successful, but it lacks authenticity, for the individual has never truly asked whether their actions, desires, and beliefs are good or just. To examine life is to reclaim agency over it, to live deliberately and responsibly. Philosophy thus becomes not a luxury, but a necessity for human flourishing. For Socrates, this flourishing, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or well-being, is inseparable from virtue. Unlike sophists, who taught rhetoric as a tool for power and persuasion regardless of truth, Socrates insists that virtue is a kind of knowledge. To know the good is to do the good, for no one willingly chooses evil if they truly understand what is best. This intellectualist thesis ties morality to rational clarity, suggesting that wrongdoing arises from ignorance rather than malice. The implication is that moral education is primarily a matter of inquiry and understanding, not mere habituation or fear of punishment. Philosophy becomes the highest form of ethical training, for it alone seeks the knowledge necessary for genuine virtue. Yet this view raises profound questions. If virtue is knowledge, why do we see so many who seem to know the good but fail to act on it? Socrates would respond that such knowledge is only apparent, not true.
If one truly comprehended the good, one's desires would align with it. The soul, rightly understood, seeks its own good, and only ignorance leads it astray. This conception elevates philosophy to the most practical of disciplines, for it alone can heal the sickness of the soul by dispelling ignorance. Just as medicine cures the body through knowledge of nature, philosophy cures the soul through knowledge of virtue.
The analogy to medicine is one Socrates frequently employs, portraying himself as a kind of physician of the soul. While others seek wealth, power, or reputation, he seeks to awaken individuals to the state of their own inner health, diagnosing the contradictions and confusions that afflict them. His mission, as he describes it, is a divine calling, reinforced by his daimonion, the inner voice or sign that restrains him from certain actions, but never commands him to act. This daimonion functions as a kind of moral conscience, guiding him away from error. For Socrates, philosophy is not merely intellectual, but deeply spiritual, rooted in the conviction that care of the soul is the highest human task. This conviction leads to his radical reevaluation of priorities. External goods, such as wealth, honor, and bodily pleasures, are secondary, even dangerous, if pursued at the expense of virtue. True wealth lies in the richness of the soul, in justice, temperance, and wisdom. Such a perspective overturns conventional Greek values, which often prized honor and success in the public sphere. Socrates relocates the arena of excellence from external achievements to the inner life, from competition for status to the cultivation of integrity. This reorientation is perhaps his most enduring legacy, for it establishes the moral foundation upon which later philosophy, from Plato to the Stoics, will build. Central to this reevaluation is the unity of virtue. Socrates frequently argues that virtues, such as courage, justice, and temperance, are not separate qualities, but expressions of a single underlying knowledge of the good. True virtue is one, manifesting in different contexts, but always rooted in the same knowledge. This unity underscores the centrality of rational insight. Without wisdom, the other virtues are distorted. But with wisdom, they harmonize into a coherent character. Such an integrated vision of the moral life remains one of the most profound contributions of Socratic thought. From this unity follows the insistence on consistency between words and actions. Socrates not only discusses virtue, but embodies it, choosing to live in poverty, refusing to take payment for teaching, and remaining steadfast in the face of hostility. His trial, as recounted in the Apology, illustrates this commitment. He prefers to risk death rather than abandon philosophy or betray his principles. In refusing to flee Athens when sentenced to death, as depicted in the Crito, he affirms that justice is not situational, but binding, that one must respect the laws and agreements of the city even at personal cost. His death becomes the ultimate testimony to the inseparability of philosophy and life, of thought and action. The political implications of Socrates' philosophy are immense. By insisting that virtue is knowledge, Socrates challenges the democratic assumption that every citizen is equally competent to deliberate about justice. If moral insight requires genuine understanding, then few possess the wisdom necessary to guide the city. This tension between philosophy and democracy, between knowledge and opinion, will be further developed by Plato, but its seed lies in Socrates' questioning of Athenian leaders and citizens alike. At the same time, Socrates' refusal to engage in conventional politics, his dedication to private dialogue over public office, demonstrates his conviction that true improvement comes not through decrees, but through the transformation of souls. This transformation depends on the willingness to endure the discomfort of questioning. For Socratic dialogue often exposes ignorance and undermines cherished assumptions. Many found his method irritating, even humiliating, which explains why he attracted hostility as well as admiration. Yet Socrates regarded this irritation as therapeutic, like the sting of a gadfly that awakens a sluggish horse. Athens, he claimed, was such a horse, noble but lazy,
and he was the gadfly sent by the gods to rouse it. Philosophy thus acquires a civic function. It unsettles complacency, challenges corruption, and keeps society alert to questions of justice and truth. Without such questioning, the city risks sinking into decadence and moral decay.
Socrates' emphasis on virtue as knowledge also reshapes the concept of courage, one of the most celebrated virtues in great culture. Traditional views often define courage as bravery in battle, the willingness to endure danger or face death for the sake of honor or the city. But Socrates interrogates this assumption, asking whether courage without understanding is truly admirable. He argues that courage is not simply fearlessness, which may belong to the fool who rushes blindly into danger, but a kind of rational endurance rooted in knowledge of what is truly to be feared and what is not. To fear death as the worst of evils, for example, presupposes knowledge one does not have, since death may be a blessing. Courage, then, is inseparable from wisdom. It requires knowing what is genuinely harmful and what is not, so that one can stand firm in the face of apparent dangers while avoiding reckless folly. The same reorientation applies to temperance, another key virtue. Rather than mere moderation in pleasures or avoidance of excess, temperance for Socrates becomes self-mastery, grounded in understanding. One is temperate not by suppressing desires arbitrarily, but by recognizing through reason which desires truly serve the good of the soul and which do not. To indulge in wealth, luxury, or sensual pleasures at the expense of integrity and virtue is to misjudge values. True temperance requires the wisdom to rank goods properly and to live in harmony with that hierarchy. Thus, temperance, like courage, collapses into knowledge of the good, reinforcing the unity of virtue in Socratic thought. The justice, the virtue most central to political life, undergoes a similar transformation. For many Athenians, justice was understood as obedience to the laws, or as giving each person their due according to custom. Sophists like Thrasymachus provocatively claim that justice was simply the interest of the stronger, a tool of the powerful to maintain their dominance. Socrates resists both the reduction of justice to custom and its cynical redefinition as power. He seeks a rational account of justice that ties it to the health of the soul. Just as the body is healthy when its parts function in harmony, guided by knowledge of what benefits the whole, so too is the soul just when its desires, emotions, and reason are properly ordered. Injustice, by contrast, is a kind of inner disorder, a corruption that leaves the soul at war with itself. This view shifts justice from external compliance to internal harmony, emphasizing personal integrity over mere obedience. The link between justice and the soul reveals Socrates' profound psychological insight. He insists that injustice harms the one who commits it more than the one who suffers it, for wrongdoing damages the soul's integrity, its alignment with truth and goodness. To act unjustly, even if it brings external gain, is to deform one's inner being, just as disease weakens the body. This radical claim overturns conventional morality, which often measures success by power, wealth, or victory, regardless of the means. For Socrates, the true standard of a good life is not external fortune, but the state of one's soul. Hence, it is better to suffer wrong than to commit it, for the former leaves the soul intact, while the latter corrodes it. This teaching stands as one of the most countercultural yet enduringly powerful aspects of his philosophy. From these reflections emerges the Socratic conception of the soul as the true self. While Greek culture often identified the self with honor, family, or citizenship, Socrates insists that the essence of a person lies in their inner rational and moral life. The body, with its appetites and limitations, is secondary.
The true self is the soul, capable of reasoning, questioning, and aligning itself with truth. Care of the soul becomes the supreme task, more urgent than care of wealth or reputation. This inward turn represents a decisive moment in the history of thought, paving the way for later conceptions of individuality, conscience, and moral autonomy. By shifting the center of human value inward, Socrates sets the stage for a philosophy that regards self-knowledge as the path to the divine. The Delphic injunction to know thyself finds in Socrates its fullest philosophical expression. Self-knowledge is not trivial introspection, but rigorous examination of one's beliefs, desires, and values. To know oneself is to recognize one's ignorance, to expose contradictions in one's thinking, and to strive for greater clarity. It is also to recognize the distinction between what belongs to the body and what belongs to the soul, between transient goods and eternal values. For Socrates, such self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, for only by understanding oneself can one order one's life rightly and pursue the good without confusion. This quest for self-knowledge is inseparable from dialogue, for one's own assumptions are most clearly revealed and tested in conversation with others.
Here lies another revolutionary aspect of Socratic philosophy, the social dimension of truth-seeking. Unlike solitary mystics or prophets, Socrates situates philosophy in the agora, the public square, engaging with citizens of all ranks through dialogue. Knowledge is not hoarded, but pursued collectively through the friction of question and answer. This democratic aspect of his method, even as it critiques the political democracy of Athens, affirms that wisdom is accessible to all who are willing to question themselves. Philosophy becomes a shared endeavor, binding individuals together in the pursuit of truth. This is why Socrates never wrote books. Philosophy for him was a living conversation, not a set of doctrines to be preserved in text. Truth was to be discovered in the encounter between souls, in the dynamic unfolding of reasoned dialogue. The absence of writings also ensures that Socratic philosophy remains open-ended, always in motion, never frozen into dogma. What survives through Plato and Xenophon is not a system, but a method, a way of living. This openness is central to the Socratic spirit. To claim final possession of truth would be to contradict the very stance of acknowledged ignorance. Philosophy is thus perpetual inquiry, a journey rather than a destination. The power of Socrates lies not in definitive doctrines, but in the example of a life devoted to questioning, to integrity, to the care of the soul. His legacy is less a body of teachings than a model of philosophical existence. The trial and death of Socrates crystallized this model in its most dramatic form. Accused of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods, Socrates defends himself by asserting that he has done nothing but encourage examination, urging Athenians to care for their souls more than their wealth. His refusal to flatter the jury, his insistence on speaking the truth as he sees it, demonstrates his commitment to principle over survival. When offered the chance to propose his own penalty, he ironically suggests he deserves free meals for life in the Prytaneum, like an Olympic victor, for he has benefited the city more than anyone. Ultimately sentenced to death, he refuses to escape when the opportunity arises, arguing in the Crito that to break the laws would be unjust, even if they have condemned him unfairly. His final act, calmly drinking the hemlock in the presence of his friends, embodies the unity of philosophy and life, teaching through example that the soul's integrity is worth more than physical existence. Socrates' death transforms him into a martyr for philosophy, a symbol of the tension between truth and power, inquiry and tradition, conscience and authority. Yet it also affirms his central claim, that no external force can harm the true self if the soul remains just and wise. His body may perish, but his philosophy endures. not only through the writings of his students, but through the countless generations who have been inspired by his example. His legacy challenges each individual to live the examined life, to place virtue above wealth and power, to care for the soul as the essence of human existence. The influence of Socrates on subsequent philosophy cannot be overstated. Plato, his most famous student, transforms the Socratic method into dialogues that explore metaphysics, epistemology, and political theory, expanding the seeds planted by his teacher. Aristotle, though more systematic, inherits the central concern with virtue and rational inquiry. The Stoics take up Socratic ethics, emphasizing the supremacy of inner virtue over external fortune, shaping centuries of moral thought. Even in modern philosophy, the Socratic spirit of questioning, of critical dialogue, of moral integrity remains a guiding light. To engage in philosophy at all is, in some sense, to continue the conversation Socrates began in the streets of Athens. Socrates' conception of knowledge is perhaps the most striking feature of his philosophy, for it overturns both the sophistic claim that knowledge is mere persuasion and the traditional assumption that wisdom is inherited from poets or priests. For Socrates, knowledge is not the accumulation of facts, nor the ability to recite tradition. It is the justified understanding of what is good, true, and just. He repeatedly demonstrates that most people mistake opinion for knowledge, speaking confidently about matters they cannot defend under questioning. The Elenchus exposes this gap, revealing that belief without rational support collapses when scrutinized. Thus, knowledge requires both consistency and justification, a demand that sets the foundation for epistemology as a philosophical discipline.
In this way, Socratic inquiry anticipates the distinction between true knowledge and mere opinion, episteme versus doxa, later elaborated by Plato. For Socrates, genuine knowledge has a transformative effect on the soul. It guides action, aligns desire with reason, and produces virtue. Opinion, by contrast, is unstable and easily swayed by rhetoric, fear, or pleasure. The task of philosophy is to convert opinion into knowledge, to elevate belief into rationally examined truth. This process is never-ending, for human knowledge remains limited, but the pursuit itself ennobles the soul. In fact, the recognition of one's ignorance is already a kind of wisdom, for it spurs continual questioning rather than complacent acceptance. The Socratic method, therefore, is not simply a tool for debate, but a way of life. By questioning assumptions, exposing contradictions, and refusing to accept unexamined claims, Socrates models a stance of critical openness that resists dogmatism. This method is disruptive, for it destabilizes cherished beliefs and forces individuals to reconsider what they thought they knew. Yet it is also constructive, for through this process, clearer and more coherent ideas emerge. Even when the dialogue ends in aporia, an impasse where no definitive answer is reached, the participants are better off, having shed false confidence and gained deeper awareness of their ignorance. Philosophy, then, is not about delivering final answers, but about cultivating the intellectual humility and courage necessary for genuine inquiry. This humility connects with the role of Socrates, daimonion, the inner voice or divine sign that guided him. Unlike prophetic voices that commanded action, the daimonion was apophatic, a restraining sign that warned him against certain courses of action but never dictated what to do. Socrates regarded it as a divine gift, a safeguard that prevented him from error. Its presence underscores the spiritual dimension of Socratic philosophy. Reason and conscience are not opposed, but intertwined, and the pursuit of truth is both rational and divinely inspired. The daimonion represents the harmony of rational reflection and moral intuition, reminding Socrates that philosophy is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a sacred duty to live rightly. This sacred dimension is evident in Socrates' view of death. Unlike many who fear it as the ultimate evil, Socrates approaches death with calm acceptance, reasoning that it is either a dreamless sleep or a transition to another life where one can converse with past heroes and continue the pursuit of wisdom. In both cases, death is not to be feared. His confidence stems from the conviction that the soul, as the true self, is not annihilated by bodily death. While Socrates does not construct a systematic metaphysics of immortality, his attitude reveals a deep trust that the soul's alignment with truth and virtue is not wasted, that philosophy prepares one for death by liberating the soul from the tyranny of bodily desires. His final moments are not tragic, but triumphant, an affirmation that the examined life remains valuable even unto death. The political dimension of Socrates' life cannot be ignored, for his method of questioning placed him in tension with the democratic structures of Athens. He exposed the ignorance of statesmen, questioned the basis of laws, and urged citizens to care for virtue rather than wealth or power. Such activity was destabilizing, especially in a city recovering from war and political upheaval. Yet Socrates refused to abandon his mission, claiming obedience to the divine command to philosophize outweighed obedience to men. In the Apology, he insists that he would continue questioning even if forbidden by the city, for to cease philosophy would be to betray his duty to the god. His defiance illustrates the priority of conscience over convention, of divine law over human decree, a theme that would echo through later traditions of moral resistance. At the same time, Socrates demonstrates a paradoxical respect for the law. In the Crito, when urged by his friends to escape his unjust death sentence, he argues that one must not return injustice for injustice. To break the laws of Athens, even when they act wrongly, would be to undermine the very framework that sustains communal life. Having lived under the laws, benefited from them, and tacitly agreed to them by remaining in the city, Socrates feels bound to honor them, even in death. His refusal to flee is not passive resignation, but active fidelity to principle. Justice cannot be preserved by committing injustice. This paradox, challenging the city's values, yet obeying its laws, reveals the depth of Socratic integrity, a model of civic responsibility grounded in higher truth.
The tension between philosophy and politics that Socrates embodies remains unresolved. On one hand, his method of questioning undermines blind obedience and exposes the ignorance of rulers, making philosophy essential to a just society. On the other hand, his refusal to participate directly in politics and his ultimate condemnation show the fragility of philosophy within political life. This tension shapes the trajectory of Western thought, from Plato's vision of philosopher kings to modern debates about the role of intellectuals in society. Socrates himself provides no simple resolution. Instead, his life dramatizes the perpetual conflict between truth and power, conscience and conformity. His legacy, however, demonstrates that philosophy can outlast political hostility. Though executed, Socrates became a symbol of intellectual courage and moral integrity, inspiring generations of thinkers. Plato transformed his dialogues into explorations of metaphysics and ethics. Xenophon preserved a more practical and conservative image of his teacher. The Cynics, Stoics, and later Christian thinkers all claimed Socratic heritage, seeing in his example a model of virtue above worldly concerns. His insistence that the soul is more important than wealth or status resonates across cultures and eras,
challenging each new age to reevaluate its priorities. The endurance of Socrates' example proves that while political powers can silence individuals, they cannot extinguish the spirit of philosophy. At the heart of this legacy lies the enduring challenge of the examined life. To live as Socrates did is to refuse complacency, to question received opinions, to seek coherence in one's beliefs and integrity in one's actions. It requires courage to confront ignorance, humility to admit one's limits, and perseverance to continue the search for truth despite uncertainty. This challenge is as urgent now as in ancient Athens, for every society is tempted by distraction, dogmatism, and the pursuit of superficial goods. Socrates stands as a reminder that the true measure of a life is not wealth, power, or reputation, but the condition of the soul, the commitment to wisdom, and the practice of virtue. Even in modern philosophy, the Socratic spirit persists. Critical inquiry, rational argument, the demand for justification, these are pillars of philosophy rooted in Socratic practice. Ethical theories that link morality to reason, political theories that examine the legitimacy of authority, and existential reflections on authenticity all carry traces of Socratic questioning. His refusal to write ensures that philosophy remains a living dialogue, renewed in every age by those who take up the task of questioning themselves and others. To study Socrates is not merely to read history, but to be drawn into a conversation that transcends time, a conversation that continues wherever human beings ask what it means to live well. Thus, Socrates' philosophy is not a doctrine, but a way of being, a relentless commitment to truth, a prioritization of the soul over the body, an embrace of dialogue, and a courageous willingness to live and die for principle. His wisdom lies not in possessing final answers, but in showing that the pursuit of wisdom itself is the highest form of human life. His death seals this truth, transforming him from a man into a symbol, from a teacher of Athens to the eternal gadfly of humanity. To follow Socrates is to accept the call to philosophy as a lifelong vocation, to live in examination, to seek virtue through knowledge, and to face even death with serenity born of integrity. Socrates' thought also reshaped the understanding of education, for he rejected the sophistic model of teaching wisdom as a commodity to be sold. The sophists, skilled rhetoricians, claimed to impart virtue and success for a fee, equipping young men to gain power in courts and politics. Socrates, by contrast, insisted that virtue could not be purchased or transmitted like a skill. Instead, it had to be cultivated through self-examination, guided by dialogue. His refusal to charge money underscored this conviction. Philosophy is not a trade, but a way of life, accessible to anyone willing to engage sincerely. Education in the Socratic model is liberation from ignorance rather than accumulation of ready-made doctrines. It is the awakening of the soul to its own responsibility for truth.
The centrality of aporia highlights the paradoxical character of Socratic wisdom. It begins in not knowing. Yet this ignorance is not mere emptiness, but a conscious awareness of limits, a refusal to pretend certainty where none exists. Such awareness is itself a form of knowledge, superior to the complacent ignorance of those who think they know but cannot justify their beliefs. In this sense, Socratic wisdom is a dynamic tension, a perpetual striving toward truth without claiming to have fully arrived. It is this very openness that has kept Socratic philosophy alive for centuries, inviting each generation to take up the dialogue anew.
Another crucial dimension of Socratic philosophy lies in his understanding of friendship and community. Socrates did not philosophize in isolation, but always in conversation, often with companions who became lifelong friends. For him, philosophy was a shared pursuit, a bond stronger than wealth or politics. Friendship, rooted in the common search for truth, created a community of souls devoted to virtue. Such relationships illustrate the social nature of philosophy. It is not the solitary possession of knowledge, but the shared quest for wisdom that elevates human life. In this sense, Socratic's circle of companions foreshadowed later schools of philosophy, which formed communities around shared inquiry and mutual support. His relationships also revealed the personal dimension of philosophy, for Socrates did not merely debate abstract principles, but cared deeply about the moral development of those around him. His conversations with young Athenians, though controversial, aimed at awakening them to the pursuit of virtue rather than seducing them with empty rhetoric. To corrupt the youth, as his accusers claimed, would have meant teaching them to value wealth or power above justice. Instead, he sought to redirect their ambitions toward the care of the soul, challenging them to question inherited values and to cultivate integrity. In this sense, Socratic education was not corruption, but purification, a call to transcend shallow goals and embrace the deeper task of living well. The charges against Socrates, impiety, and corruption of the youth thus reflect the threat his philosophy posed to traditional authority. By questioning the gods of the city and exposing the ignorance of its leaders, he destabilized the foundations of Athenian society. Yet his impiety was not atheism, as some claimed, but a redefinition of piety as rational devotion to truth. He spoke often of his divine mission, his daimonion, and his service to Apollo's oracle at Delphi, which declared him the wisest man. His crime, in truth, was not disbelief, but reformation. He shifted piety from ritual observance to care of the soul, from uncritical worship to rational devotion. Such a transformation was radical, threatening both religious and political establishments. Socrates' trial thus becomes a dramatic confrontation between philosophy and tradition, conscience and authority. In defending himself, he asserts that he has served the city better than any politician, for he has awakened it to the pursuit of virtue. His speech refuses the tactics of persuasion and flattery, relying instead on blunt honesty. He will not beg for mercy, parade his children, or appeal to pity, for to do so would betray his principles. In choosing integrity over survival, Socrates embodies the very virtue he proclaims. The good of the soul outweighs the good of the body. His condemnation, therefore, reflects less his failure than the city's inability to recognize the true value of philosophy. In the final moments of his life, Socrates provides his most enduring lesson. Surrounded by his friends in prison, he calmly discusses the immortality of the soul, suggesting that death is not an end, but a release. He comforts his companions, turning his own execution into an opportunity for teaching. His composure, his refusal to despair or rage, illustrates the power of philosophy to conquer fear. Drinking the hemlock, he departs with serenity, leaving behind not a doctrine, but an example. His death confirms the truth of his teaching, that the soul's integrity is more precious than life, and that philosophy prepares one to face mortality without terror. This example has inspired countless thinkers.
The Stoics saw in Socrates the model of apatheia, freedom from fear and desire. Early Christians admired his martyrdom for truth, seeing in his death a parallel to their own saints. Enlightenment philosophers celebrated him as the emblem of reason against superstition. Each age has found in Socrates a mirror of its own struggles, testifying to the universality of his example. The Socratic life, lived in pursuit of virtue, dialogue, and self-examination, remains a timeless ideal, challenging individuals to rise above conformity and embrace the quest for truth.
What makes Socrates truly extraordinary is not that he gave final answers, but that he transformed the very meaning of philosophy. Before him, philosophy often concerned itself with cosmology, the nature of the universe, and the origin of things. Socrates redirected attention inward, to the soul, to ethics, to the question of how one ought to live. This anthropocentric turn set the agenda for Western philosophy, making ethics central to human inquiry. From his example, we inherit the conviction that the most important question is not what the world is made of, but what it means to live a good life. That question, once posed, can never be silenced, for it arises from the very heart of human existence. Thus, Socrates' philosophy is not confined to ancient Athens, but belongs to humanity as a whole. Wherever people question received opinions, seek coherence in their beliefs, or place virtue above power, the Socratic spirit lives. To engage in philosophy is to continue his mission, to carry forward the gadfly's sting, awakening the soul from slumber. His death may have silenced his voice, but it amplified his example, ensuring that his life would echo through the ages as the embodiment of the examined life. The radical character of Socrates' philosophy also lies in the way he redefined the meaning of wisdom itself. In the traditional Greek imagination, wisdom was often associated with mastery, possession of knowledge, or even divine inspiration. The poets claimed it through the muses, the politicians through practical cunning, and the sophists through rhetorical skill. Socrates, however, shifted the focus entirely. Wisdom was not about possessing answers, but about cultivating the disposition to question, to probe, and to recognize ignorance where it existed. This humility made wisdom democratic in a way, available to anyone willing to inquire honestly. It stripped wisdom of pretension and placed it within the grasp of ordinary individuals, provided they were willing to live a life of reflection. This democratization of wisdom is revolutionary because it challenges hierarchies of knowledge. The slave, the craftsman, the soldier, the woman, and the youth, groups often excluded from intellectual prestige in Athens, could, in Socratic terms, participate in philosophy. Indeed, many of his most powerful dialogues in Plato show him conversing with slaves or artisans, demonstrating that truth is not down to social class. Such inclusivity was dangerous in a society stratified by power and tradition, for it undermined the monopoly of authority figures over moral and intellectual discourse. By teaching that anyone could pursue virtue through questioning, Socrates undermined the very structures that privileged the few over the many. Equally significant is Socrates' moral psychology, his understanding of why people act as they do. He famously argued that no one does wrong willingly. Rather, wrongdoing arises from ignorance. To know the good is to do the good, for the soul cannot knowingly prefer evil. This principle, often criticized as overly optimistic, reflects his conviction in the rational nature of humanity. If one truly comprehends what is best, one will desire it, for the good aligns with the deepest needs of the soul. Vice, then, is not malice, but confusion, a failure of understanding. The implication is that moral reform is a matter of education, of clarifying what is genuinely beneficial, rather than punishment or coercion. In this, Socrates anticipates later theories of moral development that see knowledge as central to ethical growth. Critics might object that people often act against their better judgment, succumbing to weakness of will or akrasia. Yet Socrates would reinterpret such cases. When someone acts against what they claim is better, they must not truly know it as better. Their knowledge is incomplete or superficial, a belief unintegrated into the fabric of their soul. Genuine knowledge, for Socrates, transforms desire and harmonizes the will with reason. Thus, his ethical theory places enormous weight on the pursuit of wisdom as the foundation of virtue. The more one understands the good, the more one is compelled to embody it. Education is not simply intellectual enrichment, but the path to moral integrity.
Socrates' engagement with politics further reveals his distinct stance. Though often accused of undermining the city, he did not reject civic life outright. Instead, he insisted that the health of the city depends on the virtue of its citizens, and that virtue cannot be achieved without philosophy. His own refusal to enter politics in the conventional sense stemmed not from apathy, but from a recognition that corruption was inevitable in a system driven by ambition and wealth. As he explains in Plato's Apology, anyone who seriously tries to oppose injustice in politics is likely to be destroyed. By remaining a philosopher rather than a politician, Socrates preserved his ability to challenge society without becoming entangled in its compromises. Yet this withdrawal was not escapism. He continued to serve the city by questioning its values, embodying the role of the gadfly. His service was not through offices or laws, but through moral provocation. He urged Athenians to care less for money and reputation and more for wisdom and virtue. In this way, his philosophy was deeply political, though not in the narrow sense of partisanship or governance. He sought to transform the very foundation of politics, the character of the citizens. For without virtuous citizens, no constitution could be just. With virtuous citizens, even flawed laws could be guided toward the good. Socratic politics, therefore, is the politics of the soul, rooted in personal responsibility and communal dialogue. This dimension of his philosophy resonates with later thinkers who saw political reform as inseparable from moral education. The idea that a just society begins with self-examined individuals reverberates through traditions from Stoicism to Christianity, from Enlightenment rationalism to modern civic humanism. Socrates thus stands at the origin of a line of thought that insists true reform must begin within. To change the world, one must first change oneself. To govern justly, one must first govern the soul. At this point, the unity of Socratic philosophy comes into focus. His epistemology, ethics, politics, and pedagogy are not separate fields but interwoven threads of a single vision, the examined life. To know oneself is to recognize ignorance. To recognize ignorance is to seek wisdom. To seek wisdom is to cultivate virtue. To cultivate virtue is to strengthen the soul. And to strengthen the soul is to serve the community. Every part supports the whole, creating a life oriented toward truth and justice. This coherence is what gives Socratic philosophy its enduring power. It is not a fragmented set of doctrines, but a way of being, a form of life that integrates thought and action, reason and passion, individual and society. Even the simplicity of Socrates' lifestyle reflects this unity. He lived with little concern for wealth, fame, or comfort, embodying his principle that virtue matters more than external goods. His poverty was not deprivation, but freedom,
proof that the philosopher requires little to live well. By detaching himself from material ambition, he preserved his independence and integrity, making his speech fearless. Unlike sophists who depended on fees, Socrates had nothing to lose by telling the truth. His life thus becomes the strongest argument for his philosophy. He practiced what he preached, showing by example that the soul's care outweighs the body's needs. Socrates' conviction that the unexamined life is not worth living embodies the culmination of his philosophy. This phrase, simple yet inexhaustible in meaning, encapsulates the demand that human beings must reflect on their values, beliefs, and actions rather than drift unthinkingly through existence. To live without examination is, for Socrates, to live as less than fully human, reduced to habit, convention, or appetite. Examination is the mark of rationality, the distinctive capacity of the soul to question and to seek truth. Through examination, one discovers not only ignorance but also direction, for it is in the struggle to clarify life's meaning that purpose emerges. This principle explains why Socrates chose death over silence. A life stripped of inquiry would betray the essence of his being. The examined life requires courage, for it means confronting uncomfortable truths. Many prefer the comfort of illusions, the security of tradition, or the distraction of pleasure. Socrates shatters such complacency, insisting that true happiness cannot be built on falsehood. His dialogues reveal how resistant people are to self-examination. Interlocutors often grow frustrated, defensive, or hostile when their contradictions are exposed. Yet Socrates accepts this hostility as the price of honesty. He does not seek popularity, but truth, and he knows that truth unsettles. Thus, the examined life demands not only intellectual clarity, but also moral bravery, the willingness to face disapproval, ridicule, or even death for the sake of integrity.
This theme highlights the deep link between philosophy and freedom. For Socrates, freedom is not primarily political liberty, though he valued dialogue within the city, but inner liberation from ignorance, fear, and unworthy desires. The examined life frees the soul from enslavement to opinion and passion, enabling it to act in accordance with reason. A citizen may live under a democracy, oligarchy, or tyranny, but if he has not examined himself, he remains unfree, captive to untested assumptions. Conversely, even under external constraint, one who knows himself possesses inner freedom, for he governs his own soul. This paradox of freedom, rooted not in circumstance but in self-mastery, would later inspire Stoic thought, echoing through Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. The transformative power of Socratic philosophy also lies in its emphasis on universality. His questions do not concern only Athenians of his era, but touch upon perennial human issues. What is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? What is the good life? These questions transcend time and place, inviting each generation to wrestle with them anew. In this sense, Socrates is not merely a historical figure, but a symbol of philosophy itself. Wherever people gather to question the foundations of their existence, the Socratic spirit is present. His example becomes a kind of archetype of human rationality, a reminder that truth is not handed down by tradition, but must be sought through reflection. The method by which he pursued this universality, dialogue, further underscores its timelessness. Unlike treatises or dogmas, dialogue models inquiry itself, showing thought in motion. The give and take of questioning, the recognition of ignorance, the gradual clarification of concepts, all these features demonstrate that truth emerges through encounter rather than imposition. Dialogue also honors the dignity of the interlocutor, treating the other not as a passive recipient, but as a partner in the search. In this sense, Socratic philosophy anticipates democratic ideals, for it envisions knowledge as arising from shared inquiry rather than authoritarian decree. Even when his partners resist, he treats them as capable of reason, affirming the equality of rational souls. One might argue that Socratic philosophy is incomplete, for it offers no system, no final answers, no definitive account of the good. But this incompleteness is its greatest strength. By refusing to crystallize into dogma, Socratic thought remains forever open, adaptable to new contexts, fertile in generating new inquiries. A closed system can be mastered and left behind. An open method continues to provoke, challenge, and inspire. Socrates' philosophy is thus inexhaustible, not because it contains all truths, but because it teaches the posture required to approach them. His life and death embody this openness. He never ceased questioning, and even at the end, he turned death into a new subject of reflection. The enduring lesson of Socrates is that philosophy is not about information, but transformation. To learn from Socrates is not to memorize his claims, but to adopt his stance toward life, humble, inquisitive, courageous, and oriented toward virtue. This transformation touches every dimension of existence, from personal ethics to civic engagement, from friendship to mortality. It challenges us to live deliberately, to align our choices with our deepest understanding of the good, and to hold ourselves accountable through reason. In doing so, Socratic philosophy continues to fulfill its role as a gadfly, pricking consciences across the centuries, preventing humanity from sinking into complacency. In reflecting on the full scope of his philosophy, one realizes that Socrates does not offer a doctrine, but a mirror. He forces us to confront ourselves, to ask whether our lives are guided by wisdom or by convention, whether we care for our souls or neglect them, whether we are willing to stand by truth even at great cost. This mirror is uncomfortable, yet indispensable, for it reveals the measure of our humanity. To turn away from it is to choose darkness. To embrace it is to embark on the lifelong journey of philosophy. Thus, in every age, the challenge remains. Will we dare to examine ourselves as Socrates demands, or will we silence the gadfly as Athens did?
This redefinition of happiness transforms the entire ethical landscape. Instead of pursuing wealth or fame as ends, individuals must pursue wisdom and justice. Pleasure, while not evil, cannot serve as the measure of the good, for it often tempts the soul toward excess or distraction. Honor, while desirable, depends on the fickle judgments of others. Only virtue, rooted in knowledge of the good, offers stability and peace. Thus, Socratic philosophy elevates happiness from a matter of circumstance to a matter of character. In this sense, he anticipates the later Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia, flourishing as the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, but with an even sharper emphasis on the intellectual dimension of that virtue. The moral seriousness of this teaching explains why Socrates regarded philosophy as a divine mission. To awaken people from their pursuit of shadows to the reality of virtue was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a sacred calling. He likened himself to a midwife, helping souls give birth to truth, and to a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the sluggish horse of Athens into wakefulness. These metaphors reveal how he saw philosophy not as an optional pursuit for the few,
but as a necessity for all. Just as the body needs nourishment and care, the soul needs examination and truth. Neglecting this task leads to corruption of the soul, which is far worse than poverty or disease. This prioritization of the soul explains his willingness to face death rather than abandon philosophy. When ordered to cease his questioning, Socrates refused, declaring that obedience to the divine command outweighed obedience to men. His trial thus became a test of his entire philosophy. If he valued life above integrity, his teachings would collapse. But by choosing death, he demonstrated that philosophy is not abstract speculation, but a way of being, stronger even than mortality. His calm acceptance of the hemlock was not resignation, but triumph, proof that a virtuous soul cannot be harmed by injustice. The body may perish, but the integrity of the soul remains inviolable. The lesson is stark. To fear death more than wrongdoing is to misunderstand the order of value. Most people, Socrates observed, fear death as the greatest evil and pursue wealth, safety, or pleasure as the greatest good. But this is ignorance, for death may not be evil at all. It may be a transition, a release, or simply nothingness, none of which justify cowardice or corruption. Wrongdoing, by contrast, always harms the soul, deforming its harmony and distancing it from truth. Thus, the wise person fears only injustice, not death. This inversion of values defines the Socratic ethic. Better to suffer wrong than to commit it. Better to die with integrity than to live with shame. Few teachings have challenged human instincts more directly, and yet few have inspired as deeply. In this way, Socrates establishes a hierarchy of goods. At the top lies the good of the soul, virtue, wisdom, justice. Below that come external goods, useful but subordinate. Wealth, health, and reputation may contribute to life, but they must never override the soul's integrity. To place them above virtue is to enslave oneself to fortune, to surrender the very freedom that philosophy seeks. This hierarchy is not merely theoretical, it is lived in the choices one makes daily. Each decision, no matter how small, reveals whether one values truth above comfort, integrity above advantage. The examined life is the constant reordering of priorities, the steady reaffirmation that the soul's health matters more than all else. Such a vision redefines courage. For the warrior, courage might mean standing firm in battle. For the politician, courage might mean risking reputation for policy. But for Socrates, true courage is fidelity to the good even in the face of death. His conduct at trial and execution embodies this courage. He does not waver, plead, or compromise, but calmly accepts the consequences of his principles. This redefinition elevates courage from a physical to a moral virtue, showing that bravery is not merely about enduring pain, but about holding fast to truth. It is the courage of the soul, the refusal to betray one's integrity. Would you like me to continue extending the chapter with more layers of his philosophy? Justice, piety, knowledge, politics, education, death, legacy, until we fully reach the 100,000 character mark? Or should I start giving you periodic word or character counts so you can see how close we are?
Socrates' teaching on piety reveals the same commitment to rational integrity. When asked in Plato's Euthyphro whether the holy is loved by the gods because it is holy, or whether it is holy because it is loved by the gods, he exposes the tension between divine authority and rational justification. If the gods love what is holy because it is holy, then holiness exists independently of their will. If it is holy only because they love it, then morality becomes arbitrary.
Socrates' probing shows that piety cannot be reduced to blind obedience, nor can it rest on mythological stories of the gods' quarrels and passions. Instead, true piety must align with reason, honoring what is good in itself, rather than merely submitting to authority. This redefinition threatens traditional religion, but it elevates faith into a rational devotion, a pursuit of the divine through truth. The Socratic conception of justice follows a similar path. In the Republic, Plato presents Socrates as rejecting definitions of justice based on power or advantage. Justice is not the interest of the stronger, nor is it mere contract to avoid harm, nor repayment of debts. Rather, justice arises from harmony, both within the soul and within the city. In the soul, justice is the proper ordering of reason, spirit, and appetite, each fulfilling its function under the guidance of wisdom. In the city, justice is the proper ordering of classes, each contributing according to its nature. Though Plato's elaboration goes beyond the historical Socrates, the core idea reflects Socratic ethics. Justice is not external obedience, but internal harmony, the alignment of life with truth. This emphasis on inner harmony explains why Socrates sees wrongdoing as self-destructive. To commit injustice is not merely to harm others, but to fracture the soul, to sow discord within oneself. The unjust person is divided, pulled by appetite against reason, enslaved by ignorance. The just person, by contrast, enjoys wholeness, stability, and peace. Thus, justice is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, not loss, but gain. Socrates overturns the cynical assumption that injustice pays, insisting that the deepest rewards belong to the virtuous. His philosophy thus transforms ethics from a matter of external rules into a matter of inner health, grounding morality in the very structure of the human being. Education in this framework becomes the art of soulcraft. The teacher does not implant virtue from the outside, but awakens it from within, guiding the student to recognize the truth already implicit in reason. This is why Socrates likened himself to a midwife, assisting in the birth of ideas rather than supplying them. The method requires patience, humility, and persistence, for genuine learning is not the memorization of doctrines, but the transformation of the entire soul. The student must unlearn illusions, confront ignorance, and gradually reshape desires in accordance with wisdom. Such an education is lifelong, for the soul is never fully formed. It remains always in process, always in need of examination. The political implications of this vision are profound. If justice and virtue depend on knowledge, then the health of the city depends on the wisdom of its citizens. No constitution can substitute for character. No law can guarantee justice if the people themselves are corrupted. Therefore, Socrates challenges the democratic assumption that all opinions are equally valid in political decision-making. While he respected the equal capacity of all souls to pursue truth, he recognized that without examination, opinions are dangerous, easily swayed by rhetoric or passion. His own condemnation by democratic vote illustrated this danger. Yet he did not abandon the city. Instead, he continued to provoke it, believing that philosophy was its only hope of true flourishing. The death of Socrates crystallizes the paradox of philosophy. On the one hand, it demonstrates philosophy's vulnerability. The thinker can be silenced, condemned by ignorance and fear. On the other hand, it demonstrates philosophy's invincibility. The principles for which he died cannot be destroyed, and indeed they gain power through his sacrifice. By drinking the hemlock, Socrates ensured that his life would become the very embodiment of his teaching. He showed that the philosopher must be willing to suffer injustice rather than commit it, to stand by truth even unto death. His death thus becomes a kind of final dialogue, not of words, but of deeds.
The legacy of Socrates reverberates through every subsequent tradition of thought. Plato built his entire philosophical system on the foundation of Socratic inquiry.
Aristotle, though critical, inherited the centrality of ethics and the pursuit of virtue. The Stoics adopted his model of inner freedom and courage in the face of death. Early Christians saw in him a prefiguration of martyrdom for truth. Renaissance humanists celebrated him as the rebirth of reason against superstition. Modern philosophers from Descartes to Kierkegaard to Nietzsche wrestled with his example, some venerating, others opposing, but none indifferent. In every age, Socrates remains a touchstone, the archetype of philosophy itself. What unites all these interpretations is the recognition that Socrates did not leave behind a doctrine, but a way of life. His philosophy cannot be reduced to formulas, for its essence lies in the practice of questioning, in the commitment to live according to reason and virtue. This is why he continues to inspire, for each person must take up the Socratic task anew. To follow Socrates is not to repeat his words, but to imitate his stance, to question inherited beliefs, to care for the soul, to seek truth courageously, and to place integrity above survival. Thus, the philosophy of Socrates ends where it began, with the call to examine oneself. This call is as urgent now as it was in ancient Athens, for the temptations of wealth, power, and distraction remain, and the neglect of the soul continues to threaten human life. To heed Socrates is to awaken, to realize that the greatest task is not to conquer the world, but to cultivate the self. His death silenced his voice, but his example still speaks, that a life without examination is not worthy of humanity, and that the pursuit of wisdom, though costly, is the only path to freedom, justice, and true happiness.